Well, thank you all for having me here. It's a little rundown on my background. So I'm a journalist. I've been at Wired magazine for more than 10 years at this point and have written a number of cover stories for the magazine. But it turns out that I never intended to be a journalist. I got a degree in economics in college and then went on to make a series of really disastrous economic financial decisions for myself. And ended up as a data entry clerk at Pacific Bell in California, typing numbers into a computer every day, and it was like, this is my life. And what was interesting to me about the job of being a data entry clerk, at least at Pac Bell, was that I was entering these numbers, and they were telephone numbers, and it was like if you get the bill and it said, you know, your whatever you had to pay, and you checked a little box if you wanted to be part of the Universal Lifeline program, which meant that you were below a certain income level and got a reduced rate. So I would type your number in if you checked the box, and I just did this all day, every day, just flipping these things. But if I typed the number in wrong, the computer would beep at me. And that suggested to me that it already knew the number. So what the hell was I doing there? And then it occurred to me that maybe this was a grand psychological experiment. And I was just there to see how long it would take me to go insane, which was happening, in fact. And it was around that time that I saw a flyer for the U.S. National Arm Wrestling Championship. And I was in a very vulnerable place in my life. And so I decided to go. And I just thought, look, my life didn't turn out the way I had hoped or thought that it would. And maybe I could go have an adventure on the weekend that would be fun and exciting and a total contrast to this psychological experiment. And so I drove out to Laughlin, Nevada, which I don't know if anybody has been there, but there's really no reason. And I got to the Avi Hotel, Resort, and Casino, and nobody at the hotel, resort, or casino knew where the U.S. National Arm Wrestling Championship was happening. And I was like, oh my God, did I get the date wrong? And drove all this way. And then I saw these huge guys wandering through the casino, and so I kind of followed them out to the back, and there was a garden shed behind the casino, and that's where the U.S. National Arm Wrestling Championship was happening. But I get in there, and everybody was very warm and welcoming. There weren't too many of them, but to them this was like the height, the pinnacle of their year. I met this guy named Rick Salawada, who had come from Erie, Pennsylvania. He was a plumber, and he had taken a week off of work, but he only had enough money to travel via Greyhound. And so it took him 3 days to get to Laughlin. He wrestled for 1 day, and then took 3 days to get back. But this is what was meaningful to him. And he and some of the organizers said to me, look, you've come all this way, why don't you enter? It's open to anybody. It costs $20. And I was like, well, okay. I'd never arm wrestled. I wrestled my brother maybe when we were 6 or 7 years old, and I knew nothing. But Rick said, hey, I'll teach you. It's pretty simple. Turns out, we can talk about this later, there's only 2 moves in arm wrestling. So it's really kind to beginners. There's the inside move and then the outside move, the over the top from Rocky, from Sylvester Stallone. And so Rick kind of showed me the basics. I was like, great, I got this. And so I get up there. And it's a double elimination event, and guess what? I lost twice. No surprises. But it was fun. It was like, oh my God, I'm not a data entry clerk now. Now I'm an arm wrestler. And so I kind of was hanging out in the back at the end of the event, really having a fun time and meeting people. I met Jeff Tomchason, the world heavyweight champion, and I was talking to Rick Moore. And I wasn't really paying attention when they started the awards ceremony, and I heard kind of out of the corner of my ear, 4th place in the United States in the lightweight division, Joshua Davis, get on up here. I'm like, what are you talking about? I lost both my matches. But then get on up. So I went on up. They put a medal around my neck, and they said, congratulations, you're 4th out of 4. There are only 3 other competitors in the lightweight division. But it turns out that made me an alternate for the U.S. national team. And when numbers 2 and 3 couldn't attend the World Championship because they were on parole, I was invited to become part of Team USA, and I went to Gdynia, Poland, and represented America. And that's me in the middle there. And I ended up 17th in the world, out of 18. And the 18th guy didn't show up. So I've never won a competitive arm wrestling match in my life. But suddenly, like, my life was just completely different, obviously. And a friend of mine, in fact, a neighbor in San Francisco, said, "Hey, why don't you write about that?" And I go, "Well, how do you do that?" Like, he said, "Write about it for a magazine." And so he explained that it's actually a pretty low barrier to entry business. You write a paragraph of whatever it is you want to tell, and you send it to an editor, and if they like it, they buy it. So that's what happened. I sent it to a magazine, and Maxim ended up printing the story, and suddenly I was a journalist. Kind of like suddenly I was an arm wrestler. But it was like, for me, it was more important that I was having new experiences and pushing myself and doing things that I was maybe even a little afraid of. One of the things that, again, kind of crossed my eyesight was the fact that there is a whole competitive sumo wrestling scene in the United States and internationally. You don't have to just be in Japan. And so I decided to take up sumo. And that's me wrestling Big T. I became part of the US sumo demonstration team. But, so all of these things were very kind of mind-expanding for me. But again, I didn't have any training as a journalist, as a sumo wrestler, as an arm wrestler. And when the run-up to the war in Iraq in the early 2000s was happening, I went to Wired. And I said, hey, I'd done some research on how the war was going to be wired, right? Because this was the first war of the internet age. And so what was it going to look like? How was it going to be different? And so I said, look, let me write a sidebar, like a side thing on your main war coverage. And I'll just kind of add to what your normal journalists are doing. And they said, well, we don't actually have anybody going. And I said, well, send me. Well, what are your qualifications? Well, I'm 4th place in the United States with my right arm and 17th in the world. And so I ended up in Iraq as their war correspondent. And, suddenly I was like actually a real journalist. And I really devoted myself to learning the trade and figuring out how best to tell stories and how to communicate. This is a story that I want to talk to you about. These are 4 guys that I came across. They, in fact, emailed me soon after I became a Wired journalist, and they said, hey, we are 4 young Latino guys in Phoenix, Arizona, that decided as high schoolers to build an underwater robot that would go up against some of the top collegiate teams in the national underwater robotics competition. And this was something that resonated with me, I think, because they were doing something that people thought they shouldn't, right? Or that they had no right to do. They didn't, they went to a school that roughly 80% was below the poverty line. They were building an underwater robot in the middle of the desert. They didn't even have a swimming pool. It's ridiculous. And when I got this email from them, it was like 3 words and then a line break and 1 word and then 5 words and then spelling errors and totally bad punctuation. But I called them and I said, I got through to one of their mentors, one of the sponsors of their team, and he said, well, you're actually the first national journalist to call us. And it's not the case, in fact, that we don't get a lot of media attention at this school, Carl Hayden Community High School. We get attention all the time, but it's because of a gang fight. You know, the local news crews will show up, and the people will say, and here we are again at Carl Hayden Community High School. And these boys, you know, they were 15, 14 at the time, drove their robots up to these news crews and drove circles around them and like, hey, pay attention to us. Like, okay, fine, but there's another story here, and it's maybe more emblematic. And the news crews never paid. They ran their robots into the guy's foot at one point and explained, look, we're building these robots. It's amazing. Why don't you do the story like that? Tell that story. And the guy, as they related to me, said, that's not the story I was sent here to tell. And so when I heard that, I felt I need to go to Phoenix. And so I wrote that article a little over 10 years ago, and it has kind of continued. They ended up winning the national championship, beating MIT in the finals. Yeah. With a robot they made with spare parts, basically, scrap parts, garbage. They had a budget of about $800. MIT was sponsored by Exxon. You know, had a budget over $10,000. And I wrote this book about that experience, about their experience, and how, you know, essentially when you put yourself out of your comfort zone, maybe in ways similar to what I did personally in my own life, extraordinary things can happen. I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about how storytelling has evolved in my own career, in my own life. You can see on the right side that it got turned into a movie by Lionsgate with Marissa Tomei and Jamie Lee Curtis and George Lopez. And I'd found over the course of my 10-plus year career as a journalist that magazines, as many of you may have noticed, are getting smaller and smaller in print, and it costs a lot of money to print every page and sell ads against it, and so the pressure on really in-depth stories is intense. We don't have as many words as we used to, at least in print. And yet, online, there's limitless amount of space, but the ads that support that are much cheaper. And therefore, to do the type of investigations and the type of travel that I do to tell a story are very hard to support in the digital space. And a lot of people have been experimenting with new ways of supporting that. My friends at the Atavist, who I believe have been here before, were the first to experiment with kind of a digital-only magazine supported by Amazon, in a way, Kindle singles. What I was seeing in my own experience was that there's always been this uncomfortable relationship between journalism and ad sales, right? You kind of write a story, and then you try to trick somebody into buying a watch. You know, I mean, right? That's kind of what it is. And so you talk about the iron wall between these two sides. To me, there's a more natural partnership between storytellers in one medium and storytellers in another medium. And I was seeing that when my articles were getting adapted into films, that provided a new source of revenue. And a good friend of mine, Josh Behrman, and I were having similar experiences where collectively we had sold 20, I think we're now at 28 of our stories have been adapted or have been optioned by film and TV companies. Most notably, we did Argo, and had a lot of success finding these new partnerships, essentially. And so we decided to form our own venture that would try a new way of financing basically investigative journalism by partnering storyteller to storyteller with Epic. That's our new publishing venture. And essentially, we are financing the storytelling with a partnership with 20th Century Fox, which has the first right to option a story and turn it into a movie. And if they don't want it, they don't want it, fine. And that provides us a base amount of funding to go out and find the world's most extraordinary true stories. And so that is my story, and I'm happy to talk to anybody more later.